Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and I have the pleasure today to be talking to you about terrestrial biomes. Now, terrestrial means land, and biomes, of course, are these large, expansive areas of ecosystems that are pretty much dominating the land on the Earth. And so let's jump into that conversation. What I want to say right out of the gate about terrestrial biomes is that when you look at a map like this of the land, the continents of the Earth, what what strikes my attention is that the land is really diverse. Check this out, and that it's really like a mosaic of different pieces together, and each of these different colors represents these large biomes. Like for example, the tropical rainforest shown here in this green color. Now, I know there's some characteristics about the tropical rainforest, and that's what we want to talk about in this particular video. Do you notice they're not just sort of randomly distributed anywhere in the world, but they're found right along the equator where it's very warm and there's a lot of moisture, a lot of rainfall. You can find it in Brazil, you can find it in Central America, in the jungles of the Congo, you can find it in Indonesia, for example. Likewise, you could look at savanna, you could look at desert. Desert, like you could see this, look at all of North Africa and the Middle East and Central Australia and Southwest United States or desert. We're going to go through and I'm going to be your tour guide today and take you on a little trip around the terrestrial biomes. And we're going to take a look at the chaparral. We're going to look at grasslands, temperate, deciduous forest, tundra, coniferous forest, and all of these things. So what do we want to do? Well, at the very most, we could be interested by this. Or at the very least, we could remember a few facts about these particular biomes, where they're located, and really we want to focus in on what are the important abiotic factors that determine the vegetation and the types of plants that live in a particular area will determine really the whole community, what animals can be supported there, etc. So let's take a look. So you might have noticed that the name, for example, of a biome is sometimes based upon the climatic features like temperate, tropical, or the predominant vegetation, for example, like coniferous. In other words, cone-bearing trees. Now here's the same thing, same map, but this time it's not labeled, but you could still see the desert here in white. You could start to see the deciduous forests of the east coast of Europe. You can see the rainforest here in red cutting across. Now what's fascinating to me is that some particular states of the United States show incredible diversity. Like there are several biomes that can be found in California alone. There's the grasslands of the Central Valley, and that's famous. That's internationally famous because the grasslands are so good for agriculture. California is a very strong agricultural state, and one of the premier universities for studying agriculture is the University of California, Davis, which is located right there in the Central Valley. So great soil right in here. The Napa Valley is very world famous. And then the coniferous forest along the coast, the redwoods. And then you have great forests over here on the western slope of the Sierras. And then you have desert down here, and then you have chaparral along the coast. So and then you have in the footlands. The footlands are where the valley kind of goes upward into the mountains. And so we even have savanna, which is sort of a transitional biome between grassland and forest, savanna. So it's grassland, savanna, coniferous forest, and then on the eastern side, desert. And then how do you like this? On the do you notice how it's white here? Satellite photograph. We even have some tundra in California. It's considered to be alpine tundra because it's at high elevation. So what a diverse state California is, and I think that might be one of the reasons that draws people's attention and brings out a lot of population. And so one of the main abiotic factors that determines that diversity is not only the mountain range that is along the coast, and of course the Sierra Nevada mountain range, which creates that rain shadow effect, but its proximity to the ocean also plays an important role in the distribution of the forest over here. Now look at this. Look at the amount of rainfall that we find occurring up here in the northern coast. Up here in the northern coast, this is really considered to be a rainforest. It's not tropical, it's temperate. In other words, it's not that warm, but it's a temperate rainforest. And so the redwood trees are growing up here, and look at the precipitation that is over here, and then notice how dry it is over here. So rainfall alone pretty much determines it, as well as the geographic features as well. And so let's just take a little journey. Along the coast, let me just point this out. What I'm going to talk to you about is chaparral, which is right along the coast. It's considered to be shrublands, and it grows on the mountainside, and it grows on kind of poor soil. It's kind of rocky, and there's a lot of, as the name implies, a lot of shrubs. And so the soil isn't very conducive enough to hold a lot of trees, and it's kind of windy, and the slope is kind of severe. So, but it can support shrubs. And so it's found along the coast of California. Some characteristics of these shrubs is that they're really adapted to fire. You can't get rid of these shrubs. A fire can come by from a lightning strike, and it seemingly torches all of these shrubs, but in fact they come back because they're able to sprout from their roots, which are below the ground and that are not damaged by the fire. Even more impressive than that, their adaptations to fire continue. Like, for example, their seeds are so thick that fire doesn't destroy them, but merely wears away the seed coat, and so therefore after it rains, they're able to germinate. In addition to that, what's even more fascinating is that some of the vegetation, some of the leaves of some of these shrubs in the chaparral are actually kind of oily, which creates even a really super hot fire. And as a result, what that does is that it burns away sort of the competitive grasses that would grow. And so therefore, when the shrub resprouts, it's able to grow in a non-competitive way with the grasses. And so hard to find too many interesting things about chaparral, but there's many. One of the things, it's so common, sometimes we don't even notice it. We just look around and we see this and we don't really give it much thought. But it's typical around the coast of California. And what does it mean? It means that there's sort of a dry summer, and it's going to be raining in the winter, but it's sort of mild for the most part. It doesn't really get too extreme. And this is along the coast of California. You can see here, it's dominated by this chaparral with these shrubs, and then you even get some conifers that are growing there. Sometimes the conifers don't like to grow too close to the ocean because they get the salt spray that comes out. But examples of these shrubs would be coyote bush, chamise, and manzanita. And this, it's a fact, but it's surprising that 8% of the vegetation of California are these shrubs. So it's fairly significant. And so moving away from the chaparral in sort of an easterly direction, we go down into the Central Valley of California. And this is a grassland. And what grassland is known for is that it's fabulous for agriculture. Now, these are native grasses that are here, but you could cultivate this. You could grow whatever. You can grow grapes, which is a dominant crop in California, or you can grow almonds, which is another dominant crop. But you can find large grazing mammals here, like, for example, cows and horses will be grazing. Now, if this was the grasslands in another location, you'd find maybe different sorts of mammals grazing. But the main characteristic is that the soil is very fertile. It's good quality soil. And that means that there's a lot of mineral elements there, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the fact that this central part of the United States, it's known as the Farm Belt, but the Midwest of the United States is sort of the breadbasket, not only of our country, but really of the world, that we have a really powerful ability to grow lots of agriculture in the Midwest because of the grasslands. And so sometimes we refer to the grasslands as the prairie. And you can see, can't see, but there are little prairie dogs, etc. So we even have some grassland, as I was mentioning, the Central Valley of California, located at this red dot. So it's grassy land. And so the transition between grassland as we move easterly is you'll find savanna. And savanna is defined as a sort of a transition biome, which is a grassland with a spattering of trees. It's not really a forest. The trees are pretty far apart from one another, but they're present. And it's sometimes called the foothills, the savanna. And what's interesting in California in particular, the trees that dominate in the savanna are oak trees. And so sometimes it's called simply an oak woodland. So sorry for all these different names, but that's what happens when you use common names to describe something. Everyone has something that's local. And so there's distinctive seasons. There's a wet season and a dry season. And this is particularly critical when you consider savannas in Africa. It's really pronounced. Here's a picture of the savanna, so grassland and a scattering of trees. So I want to consider wet season, dry season, and fire. These are the big issues. And so during the dry season, I mean, it really becomes dry, and so you get these large herbivores. They go on these epic migrations. So like literally hundreds of thousands of herbivores are walking and walking because if they stay in the same area, they're gonna not have enough water, and so they use sort of their behavior to migrate. So they're moving away from the dry area to find watering holes, and so that's very important. And then the fact when it's dry makes it vulnerable to lightning and fires, and altogether that's really important because when a fire comes into the savanna, what it's going to do, it's going to burn down all these annual grasses, and it's going to return that nutrient back into the soil, and it's going to make it much more fertile for when it rains. All those grasses are going to be able to germinate, and then when all these guys come back to the area, they're going to have nice fresh green grass. And so fire is really important to maintaining the biomass and especially the primary productivity of the savanna. So that's very important. And so, sorry for going so quickly over these. Maybe you don't perceive it to be quick, but the next biome that I want to consider is the great coniferous forest, the great conifers, these big trees. And Yosemite is kind of famous for these big trees, like, for example, the sequoia trees in Yosemite National Park. Coniferous forest is the largest of all terrestrial biomes. It dominates. Like, look at this. It's like almost all of Canada, and it's not even being shown here in the United States. And look at this, all of northern Europe and northern, like in Russia up in here. And so sometimes the coniferous forest is called the boreal or boreal forest or taiga. And so all of that means the same thing. And so since it's such a dominant biome on the land and it's made up of these trees, you can clearly make the association that, boy, this is really important. You can say that this is a real increase in oxygen to the world, and this is also a huge sink for carbon dioxide. So this is a huge carbon exchange. Now, what's fascinating is that these trees don't necessarily recycle that carbon so quickly because it becomes incorporated in the sugars of the trees. So basically, these trees are taking up a lot of carbon dioxide, holding on tight, and releasing a lot of oxygen. This is really, really important. So I would say it's equally as important as the tropical rainforest, though the tropical rainforest, unfortunately, is very small in terms of area. It's important because of its biodiversity. This is important because of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, of course, since the ocean is really 75% of the Earth, there's going to be a lot more carbon exchange occurring in the ocean. There's more photosynthesis in the ocean. So the ocean's really what's making a lot of oxygen and taking up a lot of carbon dioxide. But I wanted to do a shout out to the coniferous forest for being the largest biome on the land and very important. So conifer meaning cone. So you may know this already, but I'll just bring it up to your attention, is that there's two distinctive cones. They're male cones, which produce pollen, and then there's female cones. Now, the female cones are what most people just think of as cones. They're the most conspicuous ones, and they come different sizes. Sometimes everyone thinks that a cone is a pine cone. Hey, pine cone. But there's fir cones, and there's redwood cones, etc. And inside the female cone are the little eggs, and the pollen is the male. And so if I could animate this, so the pollen comes off the male cone, and this contains the male sperm, and it's wind aided. Animals are not really helping to pollinate. There's not much to attract them. It's not like an angiosperm. This is considered to be gymnosperm. So the pollen comes over here and it fertilizes the egg and it produces a seed. And then the cone either falls to the ground or the seed falls, and then the seed will germinate into a new tree. So the seed is the baby. So I just wanted to point that out. And so there's a cone. It happens to be a sequoia cone. How about that? So coniferous forests are often found at high elevation. It's a characteristic. And again, the needles pretty much are evergreen. There's no need to change colors. They're cone bearing, and the examples would be pine trees, a spruce tree, a cedar tree, a redwood tree, etc. And so there's long, cold winters, short summer, and the interesting thing about it, though it snows a lot in the coniferous forest, it doesn't provide a lot of moisture for the trees themselves. It's kind of a drier biome for the most part. And so as a result of that, the leaves of conifers are needles. Now, needles are not the best for capturing sunlight. I think that's kind of obvious. Like, in other words, if I were to draw this, a big blade like this, wouldn't you love to have this to capture sunlight? Sure you would. You'd be like, I can capture lots of sunlight. Whereas if you're a needle like this, you're like, I can't really capture a lot of sunlight. But what this is a great adaptation. There's only a little bit of water loss from needles, and there's a lot of water loss from a big leaf. And so big leaves are usually found in deciduous forest and tropical rainforest. These needles are good to hold on to water. And plus, some of them even have a waxy cuticle, which is a lipid that is on the upper epidermis, which reduces transpirational water loss. So that's kind of cool. So there's a picture of a coniferous forest. Now, I've been emphasizing the trees, but of course there's many animals that live in there, like the bear and the elk and the moose. And since there's dramatic seasons, some of these animals even hibernate when it's cold, like, for example, the bears. So the tundra. The tundra is considered to be the northernmost limit of plant growth. Anything beyond the tundra is considered to be polar, and there's no plant life. There can be animals living there, or it's just very, very sparse. And so tundra, take a look at tundra. You could, right out of the gate, you could see that it's a treeless, meaning no tree biome. And you're like, wow, why is that? Well, it's at high altitude, and that sort of speaks to the fact that it's pretty tough up here. In other words, it might be windy, and it might be cold, and the wind might topple over the tree, for example. So it's considered to be treeless. And the plants that do grow are mat-like, meaning that they're really low growing. They're hugging the ground like a welcome mat, and they're kind of shrubby. You could have flowers and such. But another characteristic of the tundra is that even in the summertime and in the spring, the ground's like permanently frozen. In the wintertime, you could actually have snow all over the ground, but the ground, the soil is frozen. So in other words, a tree would have a very, very difficult time growing because a tree needs to have a pretty deep root system in order to get the nutrients and water for such a large plant to be able to grow. And so the fact that the ground is permanently frozen, like a couple of meters below the ground, trees aren't going to be able to grow. And so this permafrost and the wind sort of maintain the fact that it's a treeless biome. And in addition to that, if that isn't enough, the fact that it's really cold and it's windy, and in addition to that, the fact that alpine, you have alpine and you have Arctic tundra. Now, the Arctic tundra is at high latitudes. In other words, like the north and south poles, you're getting up in that region. In that area, you just don't get a lot of sunlight. In the sunlight, you might get the days might be long, but you're just not going to get a lot of energy coming from the sun. And so that can't support trees either. And so you get this short growing season. And so trees just aren't going to make it in the tundra, and that's fine. And so you get these low growing shrubs happening in the tundra. And again, we even have some alpine tundra here in California, which is found at the very high mountain tops. But things like Alaska and the Scandinavian countries, like for example, Norway, have Arctic tundra. And so, desert. So, desert, we even have desert in California. We have the Mojave Desert. And so, the desert is characterized not necessarily by temperature, but it's characterized by low rainfall. But generally, they're hot. But the fact that they're sort of removed from the ocean means that their temperature can fluctuate. So, it can get kind of cold at night, brutally hot in the day. So, given this, it sort of dictates the fact that any plant that's going to be living here in the desert needs to be really adapted to low water and a lot of sunlight. And so you'll see that no way you're going to have large blades of leaves. And sometimes the needles are so reduced that they're really just spines. They're no longer even photosynthesizing. And you're like, well, how can a cactus photosynthesize if it doesn't even have leaves? It just has these spines. Well, they use that for protection, but you could photosynthesize with the stem of a cactus. All you need is chlorophyll to do that. And so in a different video, I'll talk to you a little bit about the biochemical pathways that will allow plants to survive in the desert. It's pretty interesting. So needless to say, vegetation's kind of sparse, and that the plants that are there are succulents, meaning that they can store their water for long periods of time. So when it rains, they could sort of like soak it all up like a big sponge. So when it's dry, they can sort of live off of that. And most of the animals that are in there are nocturnal, meaning that they're sort of nighttime going. And that's important. If you come out during the day, it's kind of dangerous. You could get eaten, for one thing, if you're like a rodent or whatever. But more importantly, it's just too hot. And so at nighttime, there's a lot of animal activity because they're trying to avoid the heat. And so you get animals like a lot of reptiles inhabit the desert because reptiles are cold-blooded, which means that they can sort of rely on the heat in order to increase their metabolism, and then they can sort of like be a little bit more active as a result of that. They don't have to expend too much energy. Take a look here. You can see how the vegetation is sparse. Not only is it sparse, but if you look at the pattern of distribution, it's sort of uniform. In other words, there's almost an equidistance between the vegetation, which is suggestive of the fact that resources are limited. For example, water. I don't think sunlight is really limited. So they're competing. And it's like, well, I don't see them fighting, but it's indirect competition. And it's fascinating because there's nothing growing in between as a result of that competition. So there's antagonistic relationship between the organisms because they're competing over water. Sometimes you'll find one species living right next to the other, and you're like, oh, look, they're not competing. Well, it's just that they're dividing their resources and partitioning it. Maybe the larger tree or cactus has a deeper root system, and these other shrubs are taking water from the top, and this one's taking it from a lower area. So in fact, they're not competing. Then we move on to the deciduous forest. The deciduous forest is really, in fact, all of them are, all the biomes are great, but the deciduous forest is really beautiful because it has these distinctive seasons. It has I think it's maybe most famous for the autumn or the fall, where the leaves are changing colors. Now, just to point that out, it's not that the leaves are truly changing colors. In fact, what they're doing is they're reducing their production of green. So they're not producing a lot of chlorophyll. Now, why is that? Because the winter is coming and it's sort of fruitless to try to maintain photosynthesis and try to maintain leaves in general. So they cut back on their production of chlorophyll. And as a result, you can see these other pigments that have always been present in the leaf. You get these reds and these yellows. And so the trees don't change color, but they just stop making the green. And so that I find that to be kind of interesting. And then altogether is they just drop the leaf completely, and that's what deciduous means. It means like they're dropping leaves. Like your baby teeth are sometimes called deciduous because they fall. And so why even have a leaf if it's going to be snowing and all it's going to be doing is losing water? So they shut it down in the winter time. And so the trees lose their leaves in the fall and then go sort of dormant in the winter, and they come back in the spring with a vengeance. So autumn is a characteristic of the deciduous forest. So the east coast of the United States and Europe in general are dominated by deciduous forests. And there's lots of animals that also live in the deciduous forest. So some of the characteristic trees are maple, birch, and elm. These are good hardwood. They have big leaves for capturing a lot of sun, and there's no worry about water because it rains constantly on the East Coast. Have you ever been to deciduous forest? It's raining almost every day in the summer, and of course it's raining in the spring. And so there's no worry about lack of water in a deciduous forest. The soil is generally rich, rainfall is high, as I mentioned. And so this takes us to the tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforest, I hate to put one biome over another, but I'm going to do it because the tropical rainforest, as you can see here, is being reduced over the decades by human deforestation. We really have been cutting a lot of the rainforest down, but it's found in the equator. It's located right here. It's characterized by very warm temperature and high moisture. But more importantly, the most important factor in the tropical forests of our Earth is that they are treasure chests of biodiversity. In other words, a good third of all species on the planet Earth are found in the tropical rainforest. And so we are obligated to maintain those forests to maintain biodiversity. It's the main goal of conservation biology, is to maintain diversity. So they house a tremendous variation of plants and animals. And again, it's the warm temperature that sort of does this. Like, if I can go back just for a second, there's not a lot of biodiversity as you move in a northerly direction. Biodiversity decreases as you move up into the tundra. And you're like, well, why is that? Well, because the fact that it's very cold in the tundra. Do you remember this conversation just a moment ago? It's kind of like if you throw something down or you put some meat in a freezer. It's the bio-recycling. It's the decomposition of the bacteria and the fungi that are going to quickly recycle something when it dies. And so the tundra just doesn't have a lot of nutrient recycle. It's very slow. Whereas in the tropical rainforest, it's very warm, it's very moist, and when something dies, it's a quick recycle. And so it really lends itself to great diversity as a result of that. And so here in San Francisco, we have this fabulous museum called the California Academy of Sciences, and inside they had the idea to create in this glass sphere a tropical rainforest, and so it's quite awesome exhibit. What's interesting about it is that what's cool about the tropical rainforest, you get these big trees, and it creates these layers. You have the upper canopy and the middle canopy, and then you get the ground floor, the understory. You get all these layers, and there's different strata, different things happening, and organisms are adapted to the different levels of the forest, which creates diversity because they're not competing. What's interesting is they tried to create that, and then you could see all the different levels by walking up this ramp. It's really, really, really cool. So I wanted to point that out. And so one of the things about the tropical rainforest, obviously, is that it rains a lot. There's a tremendous amount of precipitation. You get these amazing amounts of clouds forming. And it's very much like a bathroom or a steam after a hot shower. It's very steamy. It's very moist and hot. And so there's rapid decomposition. There's a tremendous variation of animals and plants. But what's fascinating about it is that the forest floor is rather dark because light is coming in. Let me just illustrate this. Light's coming in from above, obviously, but there's so many trees and the vegetation is so thick that it's really, really dark on the forest floor. So there's a real competition for light on the forest floor. And most of the vegetation is evergreen and it's not deciduous. And so I wanted to point this out too. Another important abiotic factor in the tropical rainforest is that the soil is paradoxically, that's sort of like unusual. It's it's unexpectedly nutrient poor. And you'd be like, well, how's that? Because there's so much vegetation there, I would expect this to be fertile soil. But in fact, if I can illustrate this, if these are nutrients here, like nitrogen or phosphorus, and some these compounds are also found in the vegetation. So chemicals don't move around so much. They're capable, but for example, the nutrients are here in the soil or in the vegetation. When something dies, it goes down in the soil, but because of the rapid decomposition, it gets taken right back up in the roots of another tree or plant. So most of the nutrients are located in the biomass. In other words, the nutrients are in the living organisms. And when it goes into the soil, it's quickly taken back up. And if you think about it, the nutrients are either here or here. They're either in the plants or in the soil. So they're mainly in the plants. So why do I bring this up? I bring this up because if we were to deforest, in other words, remove the vegetation, we were to take these logs out, the soil itself isn't very high in nutrients. And what's interesting is if we use the area to grow soybean or something like that, in fact, it's incumbent upon us to actually add fertilizer to the soil, which is pretty brutal if you think about that. And so the vegetation, as I was saying before, is extremely stratified. So there's multiple layers. There's this canopy layer, and what's fascinating is you get some of these flowers that are growing, and you're like, how can these flowers be growing so high off the ground? Well, they're considered to be epiphytes. Epi means upon, phyte it means plant, so it's a plant that lives on another plant. Often this relationship is commensalism. It's a type of symbiosis where the flower is benefiting. Like for example, if it's a bromeliad, it's benefiting because it's getting sort of an elevator ride to the top of the canopy by a large tree so that they can photosynthesize, and it doesn't harm the host at all. And so some of these vines that are coming down are these long roots that get water. But some of these epiphytes don't even need that. There's enough moisture on the top of the plant that it could just survive without these long roots going all the way down to the ground. They can actually get the moisture from up in the tree. So epiphytes are kind of common. And then you might ask this question, how come there isn't a lot more rotting? And like if the leaves are constantly, it's raining and the water accumulates, isn't a lot of mold? Yes, there is a lot of mold, but sometimes these trees get away with this when some of their leaves are shaped like this and they have this little tip. And so the rain, when it comes down, it actually falls off this drip point right there. And so it has this ability to make sure that the water doesn't accumulate. That's kind of interesting. You can see it here, these little drip points right here. This is inside the tropical rainforest of the Academy of Science. These are an example of epiphytes. They're growing upon other plants right here. And so the animals in the rainforest mainly live in the trees. They're tree dwelling. And there's a tremendous amount of diversity. There's a countless number of insects, but there's some cool mammals, larger organisms that live there, like for example the sloth, and there's all kinds of monkeys and panthers and all kinds of interesting things, but lots of insects. But the reason they're living in the tree is that, again, the trees are the main source of nutrients, and so the food is in the trees. So if the food is in the trees, the animals are going to be up there, and the shelter, the safety is in the trees. And so most of the life you'd have to look up when you're in the tropical rainforest, kind of dark on the ground. So cool birds, like for example, these parrots are there. And some interesting thing, you can kind of tell if you're a bird expert, you can kind of tell a little bit about where the bird might be living just by its coloration, if it's blending in to certain parts of the tree. And then you get all these wild things like these leaf cutter ants that are like harvesting all these leaves, and they're chewing them up, and they're like little farmers, and they're growing their own mold, and then they're eating the mold. It's incredible. And again, the species diversity, look at this. A single tree can harbor 30,000 different species. That is impressive. So you're like, well, there's a lot of rainforest. We can cut down some trees. It's very, very important that we maintain them. And so the sad truth is that because of the demand for that land, not only for the wood of the trees, but really the more important thing is the soil itself. Though it's not great soil, we still can use it for uh, crops. And so oranges are grown down there, coffee is grown down there, um, soybean is grown down there. And so there's a lot of pressure to cut down these forests. But in the end, the saving thing will be perhaps we can create an economic climate to where it will generate more money for the country to keep the rainforest there. For example, like more tourists will come down there, like ecotourism. And so finally, the last terrestrial biome that I want to talk about is rainforest, but not tropical, temperate. So we get these areas where it rains a lot, but it's not really that warm. And we have some over here in California. You might know that even these areas are being heavily logged as well because of the lumber. And so that's not so good either. This is a more of a longer conversation, but when you deforest some of these trees, what will happen is not only will you deplete the area of its nutrients, but sometimes there's tremendous erosion when it's raining, and then all that nutrient runoff can contaminate the rivers and then ultimately the lakes. And so we have these wonderful coastal redwoods in California, and most of the forest that was once inhabiting California has already been logged. And so there's only about 5% of these wonderful redwood trees that live in the temperate rainforest of Northern California. Fortunately, I'll leave on a positive note, is that humanity has within it the capability of such goodness. And fortunately, members of our community saw the great treasures that were found, like, for example, Yosemite. And so these areas are now preserved and protected so that future generations can enjoy them and see them in a, for the most part, in a pristine way. In other words, they're maybe true wilderness. And so we were able to see what nature really looks like, and so that it's not like brutally developed. And so this is a beautiful picture here of Yosemite Valley. It looks like it's the autumn is starting to happen. This river right here is the Merced River, the River of Mercy. And this is the largest single rock on the planet Earth. It's called El Capitan. It's a wonderful monolith. And so I hope you enjoyed this tour of our terrestrial biomes of the world. Thanks for watching.